Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Have you decided to buy an Intel CPU but you can't figure out what motherboard or chipset to buy? Because when you go searching, this is the mess you find. Not to worry, you've come to the right place. In today's video, I'm going to simplify this greatly. The 8th and 9th generation of CPUs from Intel, and then all of the 300 series boards. You can see many of them here. I'm going to break down which CPUs go best with which motherboards and chipsets, and specific recommendations on price points, and frankly, which ones I think you should buy. As always in these videos, linked in the video description below will be links to Amazon and Newegg for my recommendations. Not every board here will be linked to down there, just the ones that I think are actually worth buying. So if you want to skip ahead and see my recommendations, go check out the video description. But I'm going to go over all these in detail, talk about the differences and benefits of the different chipsets, which CPUs I think are worth buying, and then I'm going to pair them up for you. First things first. For the 8th generation and 9th generation of Intel CPUs, you must use a 300 series motherboard. You cannot use a 100 or 200 series board. Those are for the 6th and the 7th generation of Intel chips. Intel did not refresh most of the chipsets when they came out with the 9th generation. The only one they came out with was the Z390. The others all stayed the same. On the bottom end, we start out with the least expensive and the least number of features in the H310 chipset. Moving on from there, it moves to the B360 chipset, and then the H370, the Z370, and then the Z390. Now, the Z370 really got replaced with the Z390 when the 9th generation came out, and if you don't already own one, then just get a Z390. But the Z370s support all the chips. In fact, all of these motherboards support all of the chips. They're cross-compatible forward and backward. So if you already have a 300 series board, you don't absolutely have to replace it no matter which of these CPUs you want to buy. To go along with these chipsets, Intel now has 5 major series of CPUs. It used to be 4, now it's 5. Technically 6 if you count the Celerons, but we don't. We're going to pretend those don't exist. We have the Pentium Gold line, which are 2-core, 4-thread. We have the i3 line, which are 4-core, 4-thread. We have the i5 line, which are 6-core, 6-thread. We have the i7 line, which is it's complicated. The 8th generation is 6-core, 12-thread, but the 9th generation is 8-core, 8-thread. We'll talk about that more later in the video. And then we have the brand new i9-9900K, which is 8 cores and 16 threads. As far as which goes with which, it's simpler than it might first appear. This is the Pentium G5400, 2 cores, 4 threads, 3.7 gigahertz. This is currently about $75. This processor I have previously done a build video on. I will link to that in the description below. It surprised me with how remarkably capable 2 cores and 4 threads was, even in this late state in CPU development. I compared it, for example, to a 4th generation i5 4-core chip and found that this was superior in virtually every respect. This CPU is ideally suited for the H310 line. The H310 boards start at about $55, at least in the United States, and a $75 CPU with a basic $55 board is a very nice match. You can, if you wish, step up to the B360, which currently starts at about $75, and you do get more features. You get more PCI Express lanes, you get 3.0 lanes on the chipset where they're 2.0 here, you get more USB ports, more expandability, more options. And if you have a little bit of room in the budget, it does give you more upgradability if you wish to replace the CPU with a higher end chip at some point in the future. But it is not strictly necessary, and performance is the same between them. So if you're not planning on doing an upgrade, save yourself some money, get yourself an H310. It's a great match for this CPU. Next up the CPU chain, we have the i3 line. Now, I have 2 8th generation chips here, but there's very little difference between an 8th and a 9th generation i3, about 100 megahertz overall. The i3-8100 or the i3-90-100, either the F or the non-F model, whether you want the integrated graphics, all the way up to the K chip. Yes, there is an unlocked and overclockable i3. The K chip to overclock does require a Z-series board. Please don't buy this. Only consider one of the non-K chips. The price point doesn't make any sense. Putting that issue aside, the B360 is ideally suited. I don't recommend you put an i3 CPU on an H310 due to features. It's not a performance issue, it's a feature issue. These have PCI Express 3 lanes on the chipset, whereas the 310 only has them on direct to the CPU. The chipset lanes are 2.0. These have more USB ports, more expandability, more HSIO lanes. You can have more things plugged into them and doing more with them. They have more RAM expandability, and they're generally nicer choices. And considering that the i9-9900K is generally about a $120 CPU, a $75 motherboard is pretty reasonable for that. Now, when I say $75, please keep in mind that all the numbers I'm mentioning are starting at numbers. This Gigabyte board here is a great example of a $75 board. It's not fancy, it's not flashy, it doesn't have RGB, it doesn't have super duper power delivery. It's fine for this, but it's not a super premium board. And then you have this, which is a $120 board. It's substantially more expensive. It is not going to run the CPU any faster. It doesn't allow overclocked RAM or CPU on it. It's the same basic feature set, except more M.2 slots, better RAM expansion options, perhaps 4 slots instead of 2. It's got more Wi-Fi, for example. RGB is on the board, and it's generally a nicer overall experience. It's a prettier board. If you don't mind spending a bit of extra money, you get a nicer experience with more features, at least as much as you can get on a B360. Now, would I spend $120 on this? No, I think if you're spending $120, you should get at least an H370. But if you find this on sale, maybe you find it for $99, small extra price, you get yourself a premium board. That brings us to the i5 line. Now, in front of me here, I have 2 unlocked boxes, the i5-8600K and the i5-9600K. Please note, just like the K chip on the i3, if you want to be able to overclock these, they have to go on a Z series board. You cannot use the H370s I'm showing you here. Ideally, and I don't have a retail box for it, the i5-8400 or the i5-9400, virtually the same chip, just about 100 megahertz clock speed difference there, is what you would put on one of these 2 boards. These are only $10 more than the B360. And frankly, I think a lot of people should step up to an H370 over a B360 unless you're really on the bargain side of things. This, of course, is an example of an $85 board, no RGB, it's not flashy, it's a micro ATX board, it doesn't have some of the extra features that a nice big performance board like this does, but of course, this one's going to be more than $85. As with everything, spend more, get more. When you spend a few extra dollars on motherboards, generally you get a better Ethernet chip on board. You go from Realtek to Intel. You get better sound chip. You go from an 800 series to either a 900 or an 11 or 1200 series Realtek audio chip. You get a second M.2 slot. You get a few more USB ports. You get extra features, sometimes RGB, when you spend just a little bit more money. If I was putting together an i5-8400 and I wanted a really nice experience, this is not a bad choice for just over $100, and that's what I did. This exact board right here went into my i5-8400 Ultimate Home Theater PC build. A 6-core, 6-thread processor is kind of overkill for just basically playing media files, but that's why I called it Ultimate, because it will last me a very long time. Great performance, lots of expansion options, a very, very nice board here, but as I said, it's not necessary. If you do want to go to the K chip, and that's sort of a corner case for 5 gigahertz esports gaming, well, we'll talk about that when we get to the Z series boards. The next step up the rung are the i7 CPUs. I have an i7-8700K here and an i7-9700K. I mentioned earlier in the video that these were kind of the oddball out here because these don't have the same number of cores and threads that the other lines do. There's no change between 8th and 9th. An 8700K is 6 cores, 12 threads. A 9700K is 8 cores, but only 8 threads. They took the hyper-threading off of it. Yes, I know, very confusing, but that's what Intel did. Now, these are both unlocked and overclockable, and frankly, a Z-series board is the only thing you should consider for these, even if you don't plan to overclock. If you're spending this kind of money, you're looking at between $360 and $410 for these 2 chips. You could buy a Z-series board. You want the extra features, the HSIO lanes, the PCI Express lanes, just the overall quality of features for this price point, even if you run them at stock. One benefit to a Z-series board is it allows you to use overclocked RAM. All of these chips only support DDR4 2666 at normal JEDEC speeds. If you get the H board, the B board, or the first H board, the H310 or the H370, you cannot run your RAM faster than DDR4 2666. If you want to run DDR4 3200 or 3600, you must have a Z board. It's the only way to do it. So even if you don't overclock your CPU, if you want to put fast RAM in your system, then you have to get a Z board. Now, before we talk about boards, let me talk about these CPUs. If for whatever reason you've decided you're buying an i7, you don't want the i9 down there, we'll talk about it separately. If you're buying an i7, me personally, I would buy an i7-8700K. It has 2 fewer cores than a 9700K, but it has 12 threads. I believe over the next 3 to 5 years of ownership, you'll miss the extra threads. 8 threads is going to be limiting in the next 3 to 5 years. It isn't today, it runs everything great today, but I don't believe that an 8-thread processor has a whole lot of future in front of it. And the i7-9700K costs more, so you save some money. In fact, you might be able to find some used in the $300 price range, so an 8700K might very well be a nice value for the money. These boards start at $110. Now that's not too much more than the H boards, except please do not buy this board. Do not buy the bottom of the barrel boards. They just give up everything to get the price point there. $150 is the minimum buy-in point to a Z-Series board where you get decent quality components. The differences between these two boards here are night and day, although in fairness, this one over here is closer to 200, but still, putting that aside, this one right here, for 110, you give up the Intel LAN chip, you give up decent onboard sound, you give up any semblance of RGB, which you may care about or not, you give up USB ports, you give up often in either 1 or even 2 M.2 slots left with only 1. Some of these only have a single M.2 slot. They're just very limiting. And if you're spending $350 plus on your CPU, spend $150 on your motherboard and get something decent. Now, having said that, unless you already own a Z370, buy a Z390. The prices are not substantially different, at least when I'm filming this video. The features aren't all that different either, although the Z390 does have some nice new features, and frankly, just get the newer boards. However, if you already have a Z370, or you find a crazy good deal on a Z370, don't be afraid to get a Z370 and put any of these CPUs on it. If you find an awesome deal, by all means grab it. Just be aware that if the motherboard has not had its BIOS updated, these Z370s will not run the 9700K or the i9-9900K until they've had a BIOS update. And for most of them, except for the super premium boards that have BIOS flashback, you have to have a working CPU that they support in order to update the BIOS. Just keep that in mind if you buy a 370 to put a 9th generation chip into. Actually, in fairness, that's true for most of them. If you buy a first generation H370 or B360 board that was manufactured before the 9th generation comes out, and you buy a 9th generation chip, some of those aren't going to work without a BIOS update. So make sure you buy a recently manufactured board, or preferably buy a Z390. Last but certainly not least, that brings us to the i9-9900K, most likely the fastest and highest capable CPU you will ever be able to buy for a 300 series board. Not counting the KS limited edition chip they'll come out with later this year, but it's basically the same thing. 8 cores, 16 threads, currently going for $490. That's a premium price, but it is the fastest gaming CPU you can buy. In terms of consumer platforms, it is king, at least at the moment, until the next one comes around the corner. Unless you already have a Z370 board, get yourself a Z390, and if you're buying a $500 CPU, buy yourself a premium board. I have here a couple of examples of Z390 boards. This MSI Gaming Plus is a very nice board, but it's not for that CPU. This is more meant for the i5 CPUs, and if you want to buy an i5 9600K, 6-core, 6-thread, and you want to overclock it to 5 GHz with a mid-range cooler, which works very, very well, then this would be an excellent choice. But if you're buying a $500 8-core, 12-thread processor, something like this ASRock Tai-Chi is what you want to go for. This is what is on my test bench and has been since the launch of the i9. Every i9 benchmark you've seen so far on my channel has been at 5 gigahertz fixed on all 8 cores overclocked on this motherboard with a Noctua NHD15 $90 tower cooler on my test bench. That's what's done all the benchmarks so far on my channel. Very nice board, great features, and reasonable price. Having given you that nice spiel about Z boards, let me walk that back for a second and talk about an alternative. If you have a system that has a B series or an H series board, and you have a locked CPU, an i3 or an i5, and you're interested in upgrading, do not necessarily be afraid to put a high-end chip on those boards. No, you can't overclock. No, you can't put overclocked RAM on there, but the performance isn't that far off, and it's much easier just to replace a CPU than it is to replace an entire board. A good example is the CyberPower PC featuring the i5-9400 that I recently reviewed on my channel, the Battle of the $900 gaming PCs. That has a B360 micro ATX board in there. It is not flashy, it is not fancy, but it does the job. It's got 4 RAM slots, an M.2 slot. It's nice enough. But it does have a $170 CPU in it. It would be crazy, of course, to consider putting an i9-9900K on that little B360, right? Not necessarily. Don't say that so fast. While I wouldn't go out and custom build a system doing that, I can tell you that you can do it and you will still get excellent performance and a great upgrade. This is not necessarily something you want to do today while all of this stuff is current, but perhaps 2 or 3 years from now when that system is starting to age and you want a performance boost, at that point you have 2 options. You can take the motherboard out and potentially have to replace the motherboard, the RAM, because DDR5 is coming very soon, replace the RAM, and replace the CPU. You'll have to reinstall Windows, you'll have to reconnect the power cable and the front motherboard headers and the USB headers, and it's a big fat pain in the neck. You may even have to get a new license to Windows 10 because, well, frankly, the license follows the motherboard, and if you take the motherboard out of that CyberPower, it will no longer be a licensed system because it's tied to the motherboard. On the other hand, you could go onto eBay and maybe for $300 find yourself a used i9-9900K. Maybe you're watching this video 2 or 3 years from now, and you can put it on that board. You'll need a better cooler than that machine came with the Intel stock cooler, and it's not good enough. But a Hyper 212, either a black or an RGB, would actually be sufficient at stock speeds to cool any of these chips. We've done this. There's a video on my channel. I'll link to it in the description below. 2 years ago, actually almost 3 years ago, we reviewed a 6th generation CyberPower with an i5-6400 CPU in it. That system had an MSI B150, which 2 generations older than the B360, a B150 $65 motherboard bazooka. Nothing fancy, nothing flashy. We replaced that CPU with an i7-7700K, the best CPU you could install on a 100 or 200 series board. We replaced the cooler, because it came with a stock cooler, with a Hyper 212 Evo. That's a $25 to $30 cooler, and it runs at 4.2 gigahertz, all cores without complaint. That machine runs very, very well. You can do the same thing here, and you'll get 4.7 gigahertz on all 8 cores with a reasonable cooler on that i9 on a basic board. Like I said, I wouldn't encourage you to do it, but consider it takes 10 minutes to change the CPU. It can take hours to replace the motherboard, buy new RAM, and reinstall Windows. That's a pain. So just as a future thinking point of view, if you don't end up with a high-end board now, that does not prevent you from getting an i7 or an i9 later and upgrading it. So that's been a summary of all the chipsets and all the CPUs in each tier and line, and hopefully that was helpful and informative to give you a general idea of which goes to which in my opinion, as well as the upgrade possibilities. But now I want to talk about the Z series boards in more detail, specifically price points and which CPUs in terms of K chips, i5, i7, and i9, go with which boards and which price point. I have 3 gigabyte boards here in front of me. I have a $150 Gaming X board. I have a $200 Pro Wi-Fi board, and then I have an ultimate $250+ master board. Basically the features and the capabilities and the power delivery all follow these price points. And I think the CPUs kind of go along with them as well. If you were looking for an i5-9600K to overclock to 5 gigahertz because you're playing games that don't need lots of cores and threads, but they want the 5 gigahertz, you're looking for 144 frames per second, you want that superior Intel performance, but at a reasonable price, $250 for the CPU, this $150 board is a reasonable choice. You can spend more, but spending $250 on your motherboard and $250 on the CPU doesn't make sense to me. If you're going to spend that kind of money, put a bit less in the board and get a nicer CPU. Get an i7 and a $200 board instead of putting those together. So this Gaming X or any of the $150 boards would be a good match for this $250 CPU. And I think that's a reasonable choice for esports players because the 6 cores and 6 threads are plenty if you're not playing the latest AAA games or you're not trying to live stream and multitask and do a bunch of other things. You want a pure thoroughbred gaming machine for just esports titles. Coming up to the $200 option, and there are a lot of motherboards at the $200 price point. You've got this Aorus Pro Wi-Fi here. You saw a minute ago the MSI Gaming Pro Carbon. You have the Tai Chi from ASRock. There are a lot of very, very good choices at the $200 price point. If you are looking at buying an i7-8700K or an i7-9700K, $200 is roughly where I think you should be at. These boards have better power delivery, more M.2 slots, more USB ports, more RGB, and just generally a lot more features than the $150 boards do. If you're interested in Intel and you want the cores and threads to play AAA games, but the i9 is just a bit of a reach, frankly, if you can find a deal on it, the i7-8700K and one of these nice Z-series boards, I think still represents a great value for the money. There's Ryzen, of course, and we're not going to talk about Ryzen in this video, and that's a separate conversation completely. But if you're going Intel and you want something for all games and not just esports games, that's a reasonable choice. If, on the other hand, you want the best, the fastest, the no-compromise solution that will run everything as fast as possible, you're getting an RTX 2080 Ti, you're going to be spending over $2,000, then frankly, I think there's the i9-9900K, and then there's the i9-9900K, minus Zen 2, which we don't know how that performs yet because I'm filming this before that launches. But at the moment, that is king. This is not an inexpensive motherboard, but it is very, very nice. And I recently did a build, linked in the description below, with this board and that CPU. Now, I mentioned before that I have that ASRock Tai Chi on my test bench. The Tai Chi is a very nice board. It does not hold a candle to this, and after having used this masterboard with its extra features and its better construction and the full backplate on the back and just all of the capabilities that come built into it, it's about $50 to $70 more expensive than the $200 boards. But if you're spending $500 on your CPU and $1,000 on your graphics card, spend the extra $50 to $70. The i9-9900K is going to last you for 5+ years. It may very well last you for 7 years, the same way Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge did. That is a long, long time. Get yourself a super premium board, and for a relatively small additional amount of money, you get nicer features, nicer capabilities, and you'll just enjoy having it for all that time. It's a really nice combination. Thank you all so much for watching my in-depth overview of the entire 300 series chipset line from Intel, as well as the CPUs, as well as which ones I think you should put with which. As I mentioned before, all of this will be linked down in the video description below to both Amazon and Newegg. Those are affiliate links. They do support the channel. You will also find linked down there the other videos that I mentioned, my build with the H310 here and the G5400, all the way up to this epic master build with the i9-9900K. All of that will be linked down in the video description below, as well as my social media. You'll find the Tech Deals Discord, my Twitter, Twitch, and more down below. Thank you all so much for watching. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you love it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below. Questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, suggestions. Let me know what you think. What did you buy? Do you have an Intel system? Do you have something older? Do you have an AMD system? Put your system down below and tell me what CPU and motherboard you paired with. I love reading your comments. I don't get a chance to reply to everybody, but I promise you I do read them all. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time.